The rain wasn't just falling, it was a physical presence. A relentless assault that turned the world beyond Officer Jake Riley's windshield into a churning, impressionistic nightmare of greens and grays. Each heavy drop that struck the roof of his patrol car sounded like a stone being thrown. The county's most remote road, a winding ribbon of asphalt known locally as the Serpent, was notoriously treacherous in the dry, let alone on a night like this. Trees, ancient and heavy with water, loomed over the road, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Jake was a man who found comfort in routine. In the predictable rhythm of his shifts, he was a cop's cop, steady, reliable, with a reputation for integrity that was as solid as the oak trees currently being battered by the storm. He leaned forward, his eyes tracing the frantic path of the windshield wipers. He brought the radio handset to his lips, the familiar plastic cool against his skin. Dispatch. This is 7 Adam 12 checking in. Mile marker 43 on the Serpent. All quiet out here, save for the weather. It's a real gully washer, the reply crackled back. Tinny and distant. Copy that. 7 Adam 12. All quiet on our end, too. Your partner's been radio silent for the last 20. You seen Miller? Jake smiled faintly. Dave Miller was probably parked in his favorite spot overlooking the reservoir, nursing a thermos of coffee and trying to get a signal to text his teenage daughter. That's a negative. Dispatch. But I'm not worried. He's likely found a dry patch to wait out the worst of this. I'll give him a buzz. He switched frequencies. 7 Adam 14, you there? Dave. Silence on just the hiss of static and the drumming of the rain. Miller. You copy. Jake tried again, his voice a little firmer. This time, a response came through, broken and garbled. Ake PPY that you saw headlights, logging trail up. Head, check it. The transmission dissolved into a burst of static and then died completely. Dave say again. Jake waited, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. The silence that answered was different this time. It felt heavy. Final. An uneasy knot began to tighten in his gut. A logging trail. There were dozens of them out here, barely more than muddy tracks carved into the dense forest. It was against protocol to investigate something so vague alone, especially in this weather. Dispatch. This is 7 Adam 12 again. I think Miller might be checking a side trail off marker 45. I'm heading that way now. As he spoke, a pair of headlights sliced through the deluge behind him, growing rapidly in his rearview mirror. They were coming up fast. Too fast for these conditions. Jake squinted, trying to make out the vehicle, but the light was blinding. Reflecting off the sheets of water on the road, he reached to adjust his mirror when the vehicle, a heavy-duty pickup truck, swerved violently for a terrifying second. Jake thought it was going to slam right into his rear bumper. Instead, it veered onto the muddy shoulder, fishtailing wildly before correcting and roaring past him, throwing up a tidal wave of mud and water that completely obscured his windshield. What the hell? Jake muttered, his heart pounding. He slammed on the brakes, fighting to keep the cruiser on the asphalt. As the wipers cleared the muck away, he saw the truck's taillights disappearing around the next bend. He grabbed the radio. Dispatch. Be advised. A dark-colored pickup. No plates visible. Driving erratically. Northbound on the Serpent. Just past my location. He paused, his training kicking in. Something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. It wasn't just the reckless driving. It was the feeling of being targeted. Dispatch. I think I see. His voice cut off. He had seen something. Not from the truck, but in the woods. Just off the road. A flicker of movement. A glint of metal where it shouldn't be. He slowed the car to a crawl, peering into the impenetrable blackness between the trees. The knot in his stomach was a cold. Hard stone now. He unbuckled his seatbelt. Dispatch. I'm stepping out to investigate. Near marker 44. Something's not right here. He opened his door, and the storm rushed in, soaking the shoulder of his uniform in an instant. The roar of the wind and rain was deafening. He left the radio handset on the seat, a breach of his own meticulous protocol. He just needed a quick look. Officer Dave Miller sat in his patrol car a few miles down the road, waiting for the squall to pass. His radio crackled. He'd heard Jake's call about the logging trail and had just responded when his own signal had died. These woods were a dead zone. He was about to try again when the dispatch frequency came alive. 7 Adam 12, what's your status? Officer Riley, do you copy? Silence. Dave picked up his own radio. Dispatch. This is 7 Adam 14, I copy. Has anyone heard from Riley? Negative. 7 Adam 14. His last transmission was cut short. He was stepping out of his vehicle near marker 44. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air crept down Dave's spine. Jake never cut a transmission. He never left his radio. I'm on my way, Dave said, his voice tight. He threw the car into drive, tires spinning on the wet pavement as he sped toward his partner's last known location. He arrived less than 5 minutes later to a scene that would be seared into his memory forever. The flashing blue and red lights of Jake's cruiser pulsed in the stormy darkness, illuminating a tableau of profound wrongness. The driver's side door was wide open, swinging gently in the wind. The radio handset lay on the driver's seat, its cord dangling to the floor. Rainwater was pooling on the rubber mat, but of Officer Jake Riley, there was no sign. He had simply vanished. Jake Dave yelled, his voice swallowed by the storm. He drew his weapon, his heart hammering against his ribs as his flashlight beam cut a frantic, desperate path into the soaking, all-consuming darkness of the forest. Jake. The only answer was the howling of the wind and the relentless, unforgiving sound of the rain. A week, 7 days, 168 hours, for the men and women combing the dense, unforgiving wilderness of the St. Florian State Forest. Time had become a meaningless, muddy blur of exhaustion and failure. The initial frantic energy of the search for Officer Jake Riley had curdled into a grim, methodical slog. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sodden, humid landscape that seemed determined to hold on to its secrets. The forest floor, a treacherous carpet of slick leaves and sucking mud, had yielded nothing. No footprints, no torn fabric, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the earth itself had opened up and swallowed a 32-year-old police officer whole. The search was being orchestrated from a makeshift command post set up in a clearing. A chaotic hub of topographical maps, radio chatter, and the constant, low hum of generators. At its center stood Captain Marcus Thorne. He was a man carved from granite, his jaw perpetually set, his eyes a pale, piercing blue missing nothing. He commanded the operation with an air of unshakable authority, his voice calm and decisive as he dispatched teams, reviewed grid sections, and delivered clipped professional updates to the media, to his officers. He was a rock, the anchor in a storm of uncertainty and fear. We're not giving up. He told a tired-looking news reporter that morning, his expression firm. Officer Riley is one of our own. We will bring him home, but in the quiet moments, away from the cameras and the hopeful faces of the volunteers. A weary frustration was beginning to show. He would stare at the massive map pinned to a corkboard, his finger tracing the winding path of the serpent. His brow furrowed in thought, and the forest was vast, the possibilities endless and all of them grim. The one constant at the command post, a silent, heartbreaking vigil, was Jake's wife, Sarah. Her face was a canvas of sleeplessness and dread, but her eyes held a fierce, stubborn fire. She refused to stay home, to wait by the phone. She needed to be here. At the edge of the woods that had stolen her husband, as if her presence alone could will him to reappear. She'd spend hours just watching the search teams, their bright orange vests like tiny, fading embers against the immense green darkness of the trees, It was on the third day that the first report came in. Two civilian volunteers, combing a ridge on the far eastern edge of the search grid, radioed back about a stray. Command, this is V-Team Alpha. Just a heads up. We've got eyes on a large German shepherd. Looks like a stray. Real skinny, he's just watching us. Over. Captain Thorne had taken the report with a dismissive wave. Copy that. Alpha. Keep your focus on the objective. We're not here for lost dogs. But it happened again the next day. A different team. Miles from the first sighting, then again on the fifth day. The description was always the same, a large, gaunt German shepherd with a dark sable coat and intelligent, wary eyes. He never barked, never approached. He would simply materialize at the edge of a clearing or on a distant ridgeline. A silent observer? He'd watch the searchers with an unnerving stillness for a few minutes, then melt back into the trees as if he were made of smoke among the weary and increasingly demoralized search teams. He earned a nickname, the Ghost of the Woods. The stories became a quiet murmur around the evening campfires. Some said he looked like he'd been through a war, his fur matted and bearing the faint, silvery lines of old scars. Others swore his eyes held a kind of sad wisdom. He became a piece of forest folklore, a minor mystery in the shadow of the much larger one. No one gave him any real significance. He was a distraction, a phantom, a symptom of tired minds seeing patterns in the gloom. By the end of the seventh day, a cold despair had begun to set in. The search grid had been covered 3 times. The divers had found nothing in the nearby creeks. The helicopters with their thermal cameras had seen no heat signatures. The official effort was winding down. The volunteers were being thanked and sent home. The talk was shifting from search and rescue to recovery. That evening, as the sun bled through the trees in streaks of orange and purple, Captain Thorne approached Sarah. His face was etched with a carefully practiced sympathy. "Sarah," he began, his voice low. "We've done everything we can. We've covered every square inch of this territory. I think it's time we start preparing for the worst." Each word was a physical blow, but Sarah didn't cry. She just shook her head. A small, defiant gesture? "No, he's out there. I can feel it." Thorne placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "I know this is hard, but we have to be realistic." "No," she repeated, her voice stronger now, pulling away from his touch. She turned her back on him and the command post and walked toward the tree line. A lone figure silhouetted against the dying light. She stared into the deep, intimidating shadows. Her heart a cold, heavy lump in her chest. It was then that she saw him, 50 yards away, standing just inside the forest's edge where the light failed. Was the ghost? He was exactly as they described him, large, emaciated, and utterly still. He wasn't looking at the searchers or the camp. He was looking directly at her. For a long, breathless moment, their eyes met across the divide. She saw no threat, no wildness. She saw an impossible, gut-wrenching intelligence. A focus, then as silently as he had appeared. He turned and was gone, swallowed by the twilight. Sarah stood frozen, the captain's pragmatic words forgotten. A new feeling, as strange as it was powerful, bloomed in her chest. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was certainty. That dog had not been watching a search party. He had been watching and waiting. For her, the next morning dawned gray and oppressive, the air thick with the unspoken finality of defeat. The command post was being dismantled. The hum of the generators had ceased, replaced by the clatter of folded tables and the grim snapping of latches on equipment cases. The large-scale search for Officer Jake Riley was officially over. A skeleton crew would remain, but the energy, the hope, had evaporated with the morning mist. Captain Thorne was delivering the news to Sarah with a practiced gentleness that felt more insulting than comforting. Beside him, Officer Dave Miller stood with his hands shoved in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the ground. Unable to look at the raw pain on Sarah's face, we'll keep his file active. Of course, Thorne was saying, his voice a low baritone that cut through the quiet. We'll send patrols through the area periodically, but Sarah, you need to go home. You need to rest. There's nothing more to be done here. Sarah's throat felt tight with unshed tears, but her eyes were dry and burning. Home. The word felt like a foreign concept. Her home was a place of echoes and emptiness, a museum of a life that had been stolen from her a week ago. This patch of dirt at the edge of the woods, this place of agonizing hope, had become her entire world. To leave it felt like surrender. It was in that precise moment of absolute despair, as the last vestiges of hope were being packed away, that he appeared. The ghost of the woods walked out of the tree line. He didn't materialize at the edge of the clearing this time. He stepped out onto the muddy track with a deliberate, resolute gait, as if he had made a decision that terrified him but was nonetheless necessary. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. The handful of remaining officers stiffened, their hands instinctively moving towards their sidearms. This was an unknown animal, potentially dangerous. Walking directly into their midst, the German Shepherd was a pitiful sight in the clear morning light. His emaciation was stark, his ribs showing beneath his matted fur. A long, healed scar ran down his flank, but his head was held high, and his eyes, intelligent and amber-colored, were fixed on a single target. He ignored the uniforms, the vehicles, the low growl of a police K9 straining at its leash. He walked past a stunned Dave Miller. He walked directly past Captain Thorne, who took an involuntary step back, his face a mask of disbelief and annoyance. The dog padded right up to Sarah, his claws making soft clicking sounds on a stray piece of abandoned equipment. He stopped a foot in front of her. The entire command post held its breath, slowly, deliberately. He lowered his head and nudged her limp hand with his cold, wet nose. It was a gesture of profound gentleness. Sarah flinched, a small gasp escaping her lips. The dog looked up, meeting her gaze, and let out a single, low woof of air. It wasn't a bark, not yet. It was a question. Then, when she didn't pull away, he let out a short series of sharp, insistent barks. They weren't aggressive or threatening. They were a plea, a summons, an urgent communication that transcended species. Come, follow, and now! He took a step back towards the woods, looked over his shoulder at her, and barked again. For God's sake! Thorne's voice sliced through the spell. It's just a stray looking for a handout. It probably smells the food. Miller, call animal control and get this thing out of here before it bites someone. But Sarah wasn't listening to Thorne. She was looking into the dog's eyes. She saw the desperation there, the raw intelligence, the weight of a secret he was physically incapable of telling, but was trying desperately to show. The feeling from the night before, that flicker of impossible certainty, returned with the force of a tidal wave. This was it. This was her last and only chance. No, she said, her voice trembling but clear. She took a step towards the dog. Sarah, don't be ridiculous, Thorne snapped, his professional patience finally breaking. It's a dumb animal. You're not thinking clearly. I've never thought more clearly in my life, she replied, her eyes never leaving the dog. She looked at Dave Miller, whose face was a mixture of awe and conflict. Dave! He knows where Jake is, I know it. The dog seemed to understand. He whined, a high, anxious sound, and nudged her hand again. More forcefully this time. Miller looked from Sarah's fiercely determined face to the dog's desperate eyes, and then to his captain, who was shaking his head in disgust. For a week. He had followed protocol. For a week. He had followed Thorne. And for a week. They had found nothing. Guilt had been eating him alive, guilt for that last. broken transmission, for not getting to Jake sooner. Protocol had failed. Logic had failed. Maybe it was time for a little faith. With all due respect. Captain, Miller said, his voice quiet but firm as he stepped forward to stand beside Sarah. Procedure has gotten us nowhere. I'm going with her. Thorne's eyes narrowed. Officer Miller, that is an order. Stand down. I can't do that, sir, Dave said, meeting his captain's icy glare without flinching, before Thorne could respond. Sarah had already made her choice. She turned her back on the captain, on the dismantled camp, on the world of logic and reason. She looked at the scarred, hopeful face of the stray dog. Okay, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Show me, as if a contract had been sealed. The dog let out one final, sharp bark, then turned and trotted towards the tree line. Not running, but moving with purpose. Looking back every few seconds to ensure his two followers were with him, without a second glance at their stunned captain. Sarah and Dave Miller plunged into the deep woods, following an impossible guide into the heart of the forest that had, until now, offered them only silence. The forest swallowed them whole. One moment they were in the relative order of the command post, the next they were in a primeval world of dripping leaves and tangled undergrowth. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying pine. Their guide, the ghost dog, moved with a surprising stamina, his lean body weaving through the dense foliage with an unerring sense of direction. Sarah's world narrowed to the sight of the dog's sable-colored back and Dave Miller's steady presence beside her. Adrenaline coursed through her, a potent cocktail of terror and wild, irrational hope. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. She started talking to the dog in a low whisper, as if to encourage them all. That's it. Boy, we're right behind you. Just show us where he is. She decided on a name for him, something simple and strong that felt right on her tongue. Come on, Max, take us to Jake. The dog, Max, seemed to respond to the name, his ear twitching as he glanced back, his amber eyes seeming to offer reassurance before he pressed onward. Dave, meanwhile, was operating on pure training. His initial defiance of Thorne had been an act of faith, but now his cop's mind was working, calculating. He noted the direction of the sun, the unique shape of a lightning-scarred oak, the sharp bend in a shallow, fast-moving creek they were forced to wade through. He was creating a mental map, acutely aware that they were moving into an area marked as impassable on the official search grids. The dog wasn't just wandering, he was following a path he knew intimately, a path no search party would ever have taken. For over an hour, they pushed on, the trek becoming a grueling test of endurance. Scratches crisscrossed Sarah's arms and her lungs burned, but she refused to slow down. The dog's unwavering purpose was a current that pulled her along. Finally, Max slowed, his body tensing. He crested a small rise and stopped, waiting for them, as they caught up, panting. They saw what he had been leading them to. It was a small, dilapidated cabin, nestled in a hollow and almost completely overgrown. Its roof sagged, its windows were boarded up, and the wood of its walls was gray and rotting. It was a place long forgotten by the world, a perfect place to hide a terrible secret. A cold dread washed over Sarah. Was this Jake's tomb? But Max didn't go to the cabin's door. He veered to the side, to a large, messy pile of debris stacked against the foundation, rotting planks of wood, rusted sheets of corrugated tin, and heaps of branches and leaves that looked too fresh, too deliberately placed. Max began to dig. He didn't just scratch at the ground, he attacked the pile with a frantic, desperate energy. He whined, a high-pitched, agonizing sound that tore at Sarah's heart. He used his paws to claw away dirt and leaves, and his teeth to seize and rip at the smaller pieces of wood. Tossing them aside? My God, Dave breathed, seeing the raw purpose in the dog's actions. Help him. They rushed forward, tearing at the heavy debris. The wood was waterlogged and heavy, the rusted metal sharp. Sarah worked without feeling the splinters that pierced her hands. For a terrifying minute, they found nothing but more dirt and refuse. A sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced Sarah's hope. Was Thorne right? Was it just a dumb animal? Then Dave grunted, "Wait, I smell something." It was faint, almost lost beneath the smell of rot and wet earth. But it was unmistakable. It was the scent of stale sweat, of human life, with a surge of renewed strength. They heaved a large, heavy piece of old plywood aside, and they saw it, beneath the board. In a shallow depression that might once have been a root cellar, was a hand. It was pale and smeared with dirt, but it was a human hand. Jake Sarah's scream was a raw, primal sound. She fell to her knees, clawing at the remaining dirt with her bare hands. Dave was right beside her, and together they uncovered him. He was lying on his side, his body unnaturally still. His face was pale and gaunt under a week's worth of beard, his lips cracked and blue. A crude, filthy bandage was wrapped around his head, matted with dried blood. His left leg was bent at a sickening, unnatural angle, but he was breathing. His eyelids fluttered open, the blue irises unfocused and cloudy. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping whisper came out. Sarah. Tears streamed down Sarah's face, washing away the grime as she reached out and gently touched his cheek. I'm here. Jake? I'm here. We've got you. Dave was already on his radio, his voice shaking but loud and clear as he yelled their coordinates, the ones he had so carefully tracked. Dispatch. This is Officer Miller. I've found him. I have found Officer Riley. He's alive, I repeat. He is alive. I need a medevac at these coordinates immediately and send everyone. As the dispatcher's frantic, joyful acknowledgments crackled back. Sarah held her husband's hand, her tears falling onto his dirt-caked skin. The official narrative was already locking into place in Dave's mind. The story he would tell the world, Jake, the heroic cop, had stumbled onto a criminal hideout. He had been viciously attacked and left for dead, buried in a shallow grave, and a stray dog, a one-in-a-million miracle, had led them to him just in time. Max, his great task complete, had collapsed a few feet away. His body trembled with utter exhaustion, his chest heaving with great, gulping breaths. But his head was up, and is tired. Wise eyes never once left the man he had refused to abandon. In the distance, the faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of helicopter blades began to beat against the silent air. Help was coming. Jake was alive. It felt like the end of a nightmare, but for everyone involved. The story was just beginning. The world returned to Jake Riley in sterile. White flashes, the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, the antiseptic smell of the hospital, the dull, throbbing ache in his head, and the heavy, immovable weight of the cast on his leg. He was adrift in a sea of medication and exhaustion, but anchored by the constant, gentle presence of Sarah's hand in his, outside the quiet bubble of his hospital room. The story had exploded. Officer Jake Riley was the hero cop who had survived the unthinkable. Max was the miracle dog of St. Florian, a canine legend whose story graced every news channel and morning show. Donations for his care poured into the local animal shelter. The department was inundated with calls from people wanting to adopt a German shepherd. The narrative was simple, powerful, and universally accepted. A good cop had faced down evil, and a loyal animal had performed a miracle. Captain Marcus Thorne was the face of that narrative. He handled the press with masterful skill. his tall, commanding figure a symbol of the department's resilience. He stood on the hospital steps, praising Jake's courage and Max's incredible loyalty. "It's a testament to Officer Riley's spirit," he declared, his voice resonating with pride. "And it's a powerful reminder that heroes can be found in all forms, some even on four legs. We are immensely proud and grateful." But inside the room, Jake's mind was a broken mirror, reflecting fragments of the truth he couldn't piece together. He'd told the investigators what little he could remember: the rain, the reckless truck, stepping out of his car. After that, there was only a chaotic jumble of terrifying sensations: the feeling of being dragged through wet leaves, the sharp, blinding pain in his head, and other things. Things that made no sense. He remembered a voice. It wasn't the rough, panicked shout of a common criminal. It was calm, measured, and chillingly familiar. A voice accustomed to giving orders. And there was a smell. Amidst the scent of mud and blood, he remembered the distinct, expensive fragrance of sandalwood and cedar. It was the cologne someone at the precinct wore. He couldn't place who, but the scent memory was vivid, a ghost in the sterile air of the hospital room. These details were glitches in the official story, dissonant notes in a simple, heroic anthem: Max. Having been reluctantly granted visitation rights after Sarah waged a quiet but fierce campaign with the hospital administration, was a permanent fixture at the foot of Jake's bed. He was a model of tranquility, allowing nurses to check Jake's vitals and accepting gentle pats from a grateful Dave Miller. He seemed to understand the solemnity of the healing environment. This changed the moment Captain Thorne walked through the door. Thorne entered with a broad, confident smile, carrying a bouquet of flowers. "How's our hero doing?" he boomed, his presence filling the small room, before Sarah or Jake could answer. Max was on his feet. The transformation was instantaneous and shocking. A low, guttural growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor. The fur along his spine, his hackles, stood up straight. He moved with a silent, fluid grace, planting himself directly between the captain and Jake's bed. He didn't bark or lunge, he simply stood there, a silent, menacing sentinel. His amber eyes locked on Thorne with an expression of pure, undiluted loathing. Thorne stopped in his tracks, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He let out a nervous chuckle. "Whoa there. Boy. Protective. I see. Max." "No," Sarah said softly, though she made no move to grab him. She had never seen the dog act this way. "It's fine," Thorne said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. Though he didn't step any closer. He's been through a lot. Probably just doesn't trust anyone in a uniform right now. Except for Jake. He set the flowers down on a side table, his movements a little too quick, his jovial demeanor feeling forced. "You just focus on getting better. Riley, your desk will be waiting for you." He made a few more pleasantries, his eyes continually flicking towards the silently growling dog. Before making a hasty exit, "I'll let you rest," he said from the doorway. "Good to see you, Jake." The moment the door clicked shut behind the captain, Max's entire body relaxed. The growl ceased, his hackles settled. With a heavy sigh, he laid back down at the foot of the bed, placing his head on his paws. Though his eyes remained open, watchful, Jake lay back against his pillows, his heart pounding with a strange new anxiety. He had seen the look in Thorne's eyes when he looked at Max, not just annoyance, but a flicker of something else. Something that looked like fear. The official story was clean and heroic, but the two beings he trusted most in the world were telling him something different. His own fractured memory, with its familiar voice and phantom cologne, was whispering that something was wrong. And Max. The dog who had walked through hell to save him had just confirmed it with a terrifying, silent clarity. The enemy wasn't some random thug in the woods. The enemy had a face, a name, and he had just walked out of this room. Jake's first stop after being discharged from the hospital wasn't home. It was the county animal shelter. The paperwork to officially adopt Max was a bureaucratic formality, a series of signatures that felt ridiculously small for an act that felt so monumental. Walking out into the bright sunlight, with Sarah on one arm and Max's leash held firmly in his other hand, Jake felt a profound sense of rightness. He wasn't just bringing a pet home, he was bringing home his partner, his guardian, his rescuer. Life at home settled into a new, quiet rhythm, dictated by Jake's slow and frustrating recovery. He was a man of action, now confined to an armchair, his broken leg propped up on a pillow. His world shrunk to the four walls of his living room. The headaches were a constant, dull throb behind his eyes, a painful reminder of the gaps in his memory. Sarah was his rock, her steady love a balm on his frayed nerves. But it was Max who became his shadow. The dog was no longer the wary, wild creature from the woods. He seemed to understand his new role implicitly. He was a silent, constant presence. Sleeping on a rug by Jake's bed at night, his breathing a comforting counterpoint to the ticking clock. During the day, he'd lie at Jake's feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes were always alert. Watching, waiting, the bond between them, forged in terror and desperation, now deepened in the quiet safety of home. It was a bond of brothers, a silent understanding that needed no words, unable to patrol the streets. Jake turned his sharp, analytical mind to the one thing he could control: the official case file of his own attack. Captain Thorne had brought it over personally, a thick manila folder filled with reports, witness statements or lack thereof, and forensic data. It was an act of supposed transparency and support. "Everything we have is in there." "Jake," Thorne had said, placing the file on the coffee table. "We'll get these guys. It's just a matter of time." The file painted a clear picture. The perpetrators were identified as two known meth heads with a history of violent robberies, men who had conveniently disappeared the day after the attack. An anonymous tip had pointed the finger at them. It was neat, tidy, and to Jake, it felt completely, fundamentally wrong. One afternoon, with Sarah out running errands, Jake began to read the report aloud, hoping the sound of his own voice might dislodge a memory. Max lay on the floor nearby, dozing in a patch of sunlight. "Statement of Captain Marcus Thorne," Jake read, his voice flat. "I arrived on scene at approximately 22:45 hours. I immediately organized the perimeter." From the floor, a low sound rumbled. So quiet, Jake almost missed it. He looked down. Max had lifted his head. His ears were pricked, and a low, almost inaudible growl was vibrating in his chest. Jake paused, a strange idea forming in his mind. He flipped a few pages. Forensics report. Soil samples collected. He read a dull, technical paragraph. Max relaxed, laying his head back down. Jake's heart began to beat a little faster. He flipped back to Thorne's statement, based on the evidence and known associates. The primary suspects are identified at... He read the names of the two meth heads. Max didn't stir. He may as well have been asleep. Jake took a breath, his mouth suddenly dry. He went back to the timeline Thorne had established. Given the location of the abandoned vehicle and the likely escape route toward the old logging trails, the growl returned. It was deeper this time, more insistent. Max sat up, his intelligent eyes fixed on Jake, his body tense. A chill ran down Jake's spine. It wasn't a coincidence. He looked down at the dog, whose gaze was steady and knowing. It was a look that said, "You see, you hear it too." The lies. The official report was a masterpiece of fiction, and Thorne was its author. The anonymous tip that identified the suspects, it had to have come from Thorne himself. A perfect way to create a false trail and close the case on his own horrific crime. Jake's suspicion, born from a phantom scent and a half-remembered voice. now had a witness to corroborate it. A silent, four-legged witness who missed nothing. He closed the file, the paper feeling slick and dishonest beneath his fingers. He looked at Max, who whined softly and came closer, nudging Jake's hand with his head. A silent pact was made in that quiet living room. They were a team. A man stripped of his authority and a dog who couldn't speak. Together, they were the only ones who knew the truth. And together, they would have to find a way to prove it. The hunt was no longer in the dark woods, but here, in the open. And it would have to be a hunt conducted in absolute secrecy. The days that followed were a quiet, nerve-wracking chess match played out in Jake's mind. He was a man with a devastating secret, forced to wear a mask of placid recovery. He smiled at neighbors, thanked well-wishers, and dutifully performed the physical therapy exercises that were meant to heal his body. All while his mind raced, trying to find a way to expose a monster who wore the same uniform he did. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own home, with Thorne's carefully constructed fiction as the bars of his cage. His only confidant was Max. The dog seemed to sense the shift in Jake, the new, sharp edge of purpose beneath his quiet demeanor. Max's role evolved from a comforting presence to an active participant in their silent conspiracy. He was no longer just watching Jake. He was watching for him, his ears swiveling at the sound of every car that passed, his body tensing whenever the phone rang. Then, Max's behavior became strange. It started subtly. One morning, as Jake sat in his armchair, staring blankly at the television, Max trotted into the room from the direction of the back hallway. He dropped something damp and grimy onto the rug at Jake's feet. It was a single work glove, stiff with dried mud and smelling of the earth. "What's this?" boy Jake asked, picking it up. He recognized it as one of his old gardening gloves. He must have left it in the mudroom. He assumed Max was just being a typical dog, bringing him a random object to play with. He tossed it aside and didn't think much of it. 2 days later, Max did it again. This time, he emerged from the bedroom, his tail giving a low, purposeful wag. He nudged Jake's hand with his nose and deposited a small, metallic object into his palm. It was a cufflink. It was old, tarnished silver, with a simple, elegant knot design. Jake stared at it, a flicker of recognition stirring. It had belonged to his father. He hadn't seen it in years and had assumed it was long lost. He figured it must have rolled under the dresser, and Max, with his keen nose, had simply found it. A strange coincidence. But the third time, it was impossible to ignore. It happened late one night. The house was still. The only sound the hum of the refrigerator. Jake couldn't sleep. He was sitting in the dark living room, the case file open on his lap, going over the lies again and again, searching for a crack, a single loose thread he could pull. Max, who had been lying by the fireplace, got up. He walked over to the wall where a collection of family photos was hung. He stopped beneath a specific one, a framed, black and white photograph of a much younger Jake, barely 20, standing proudly beside his father, both of them in dress uniform. It was the last picture taken of his dad before he was killed in a botched robbery investigation, a case that was officially closed but had always been shrouded in unanswered questions. Max looked at the photograph, then he looked at Jake. Then he lowered his head and began to scratch at the hardwood floor directly beneath the picture. Scrape, scrape, scrape! The sound was soft but insistent, methodical. It wasn't the frantic digging Jake had witnessed at the cabin. This was deliberate, focused. Max! What is it? Jake whispered, wheeling himself closer in his office chair. What's down there? Max whined, a low, urgent sound, and scratched again, his claws making faint marks on the polished wood. He looked up at Jake, his amber eyes shining in the dim light, and his gaze was so full of meaning, so intelligent, that it sent a shiver down Jake's spine. This wasn't random. This wasn't a game. the glove, the cufflink, and now this. Max wasn't just finding things, he was delivering messages. The glove, caked in mud, was a reminder of where Jake had been found, of being buried. The cufflink was a link to his father, to his legacy, and now, this spot on the floor, beneath the photograph of the man who had taught him what it meant to be a cop. It was a trail of breadcrumbs, laid out by a guide who couldn't speak the language of men but had found a way to communicate nonetheless. Max was telling him that the answers he was looking for weren't in Thorne's fabricated report. The answers were here, in his own house, and they were connected. Somehow, to the father he had lost so long ago, trusting the dog's incredible, inexplicable instinct. Jake reached down, his fingers tracing the seams of the floorboards. They felt solid, immovable, but Max was insistent, nudging his hand, whining with frustration. There was something here, something his father had left behind. Something Max, and only Max, knew he had to find. The true mission was just beginning. The frustration was a physical thing, a coiling knot in Jake's gut. He was a man of action, reduced to staring at a piece of wood he couldn't move. He ran his fingers over the faint scratches Max had made, then pressed down on the edge of the floorboard. It didn't budge. It would take tools and leverage. Two things he, with his leg in a cast, did not have. He would have to tell Sarah. The thought made him uneasy. She had been his anchor through this ordeal, but what he was about to ask of her to help him tear up their living room floor based on the behavior of a dog sounded like madness. It bordered on obsession. The kind of behavior a psychiatrist might label as a symptom of his trauma. When she returned, he took a deep breath and explained. He told her everything, starting with Max's growl at the mention of Thorne's name, to the trail of objects, and finally to the insistent scratching beneath their family photos. He watched her face carefully, expecting to see pity or alarm. Instead, he saw a flicker of the same fierce determination she'd had at the edge of the woods when she'd first decided to trust Max. She listened without interruption, her gaze shifting from Jake's intense face to the dog, who sat beside him like a silent, furry co-conspirator. The crawl space. She said when he had finished, "There's a toolbox in the crawl space under the house. I'll get it." There was no questioning, no doubt. She trusted him, and she trusted the dog who had brought him back to her. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled him washed over Jake. He wasn't alone in this. Minutes later, Sarah returned with a dusty toolbox, using a pry bar and a hammer. They went to work. The old wood groaned in protest, but finally, with a loud crack, the end of the board splintered and lifted. The air that rose from the darkness beneath was cool and musty, the smell of time itself, peering into the void. They saw it. It wasn't just an empty space. Tucked between two floor joists sat a gray, metal lockbox, the kind used for important documents. It was covered in a thick layer of dust but showed no signs of rust. Having been protected from the elements for years, it was heavy, solid, a time capsule. They brought it out into the light of the living room. There was a simple lock on the front, but it was no match for the pry bar. With another wrench of metal, the lid popped open. The contents were not what Jake expected. There was no money, no hidden weapon. The box was packed with neatly organized files, several small notebooks with worn covers, and a plastic bag full of micro-cassette tapes, each one carefully labeled with a date and a series of initials. It was an investigator's secret trove. His father's, his hands trembling slightly. Jake lifted out the top file, the label, written in his father's familiar, sharp handwriting, read internal anomalies. He opened it, and a ghost walked into the room. For the next hour, he and Sarah sifted through a history his father had hidden from the world. It was a chronicle of his off-the-books investigations, suspicions he couldn't voice, and patterns he couldn't ignore. Cold cases that weren't cold, just buried. Then Jake found the file that made his blood run cold. The case was labeled Operation Nightingale, a suspected corruption ring within the department from over 20 years ago. The ring dealt in smuggled electronics, confiscated liquor, anything of value that could be siphoned from the evidence locker and sold on the black market. The pages were filled with his father's meticulous notes, detailing discrepancies in evidence logs and tracing the flow of goods. His father had a primary person of interest, a young, ambitious rookie who always seemed to be on duty when key evidence was transferred. A rookie who, despite his modest salary, had just bought a new car and was seen in expensive restaurants. A rookie whose name appeared again and again in the margins, circled in red ink. Officer Marcus Thorne. A wave of nausea hit Jake. He felt Sarah's hand grip his shoulder, her sharp intake of breath telling him she had seen it too. But the final, damning piece of the puzzle lay on the last page of the file, a hand-drawn map. It was a rough sketch of the St. Florian State Forest. His father had noted several locations, potential meeting spots for the smuggling ring, the primary hub of their operation. The location, circled multiple times, was described as a cluster of abandoned hunting cabins, deep in the woods, accessible only by overgrown logging trails, the very same remote, impassable part of the forest where Jake had been left for dead. Jake stared at his father's notes, the yellowed paper, the faded ink. This was never about a random attack. He hadn't just stumbled into a crime scene, he had stumbled into the final, bloody chapter of his father's last case. Thorne hadn't just tried to kill a fellow cop. He had tried to silence the son of the first man who had ever gotten close to exposing him. He looked over at Max, who had been watching them intently, his head cocked. The dog hadn't just led him to a box. He had unearthed a legacy of betrayal and a 20-year-old crime. And he had, in that moment, given Jake's fight a whole new, terrifying, and deeply personal meaning. The quiet living room felt like a tomb. The air was thick with the ghosts of the past, with the weight of a 20-year-old betrayal that had reached across time to claim another victim. Jake sat on the floor, his father's meticulously organized files spread around him like fallen leaves. Sarah knelt beside him, her hand resting on his back. A silent, steadying pressure. The pieces were all there, a mosaic of corruption and murder, and the face at the center of it all was the smiling, confident face of Captain Marcus Thorne, with the framework of his father's investigation laid bare. Jake's own fractured memories began to violently snap into place. The glitches in his recall were no longer random. They were signposts he had been unable to read. He closed his eyes, shutting out the living room, and let himself fall back into the rain-swept darkness of that night. The headlights that had blinded him, they weren't from a random, reckless driver. It was a coordinated move, a herding tactic designed to force him to stop, to get him out of the controlled environment of his patrol car. He remembered the flicker of movement he'd seen in the woods, the glint of metal that had drawn him out. It was a lure, a trap, and the voice, the calm. Authoritative voice he hadn't been able to place. He could hear it now with chilling clarity, echoing in the vault of his memory. It wasn't a shout, it was a cold, simple command. Finish it, no witnesses. It was Thorne's voice. He was there, Jake whispered, his eyes flying open to look at Sarah. Thorne was there. I remember the smell of his cologne, sandalwood and cedar. He was standing right there, watching. The whole horrific tableau played out in his mind. He must have stumbled upon one of their deals. The modern incarnation of Operation Nightingale. Maybe he recognized a face or a vehicle in that split second. Thorne would have seen not just Officer Riley, but the ghost of his father. He couldn't risk a second Riley getting close, starting to ask the same questions his father had all those years ago. The attack wasn't just a panicked reaction, it was the brutal, definitive silencing of a legacy threat. He looked across the room at Max. Who was watching him with that same unnerving intelligence? And suddenly, the dog's entire story became devastatingly clear. My God. Sarah. Jake breathed, his voice filled with awe and horror. Max wasn't just a stray who found me by chance. He saw it. He must have been hiding in the woods. And he saw the whole thing. He could picture it through the dog's eyes, the blinding headlights. The struggle. The sickening thud of the blow to his own head. Max must have watched as Thorne stood over his fallen body, as his men dragged him to that forgotten cabin. He must have witnessed them burying him alive. It explained everything: the dog's initial terror, his refusal to approach the search parties that were, unknowingly, led by the very monster he'd seen orchestrate the crime. It explained the specific, absolute, and undiluted hatred he reserved only for Captain Thorne. And it explained his desperate mission. For a week, that brave animal had wrestled with his own fear, shadowing the search, waiting for the one person he knew he could trust, the woman whose scent was intertwined with that of the man he was trying to save. The immensity of what they were up against crashed down on Jake. They had the truth, a spectacular, explosive truth that could dismantle the department's leadership, but they had no proof. Nothing. It was the word of a man with a medically documented head trauma against a decorated and beloved police captain. It was the evidence of a hidden box of 20-year-old notes and the silent testimony of a dog. In any court, in any investigation, they would be laughed out of the room. Thorne had a 2-decade head start, a network of loyalists and control of the entire narrative. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. His eyes fell upon the plastic bag of micro-cassette tapes his father had collected. The labels were faded, marked with dates and initials he didn't recognize. Voices from the grave. He had no idea what was on them interviews. Recorded phone calls, secret meetings. They could be nothing, or they could be everything. Or a new feeling began to displace the horror and the grief. It was a cold, hard resolve that settled deep in his bones. He was no longer a victim recovering from an attack. He was an investigator. He was his father's son. He didn't finish it, Jake said softly, looking at Sarah, his eyes burning with a new fire. Thorne made one mistake. He left a witness. He wasn't talking about Max. He was talking about himself. And I have to finish what my father started. The first challenge was finding a machine that could play the 2-decade-old microcassettes. After a frantic search online, Sarah found a dusty, used recorder from an electronics hobbyist across town. While she was gone, Jake sat with the tapes, turning them over in his hands. They felt both impossibly fragile and incredibly heavy, a faint hope encased in cheap plastic. His newfound resolve was immediately put to the test. Just before noon, a familiar black SUV pulled into his driveway. Captain Thorne. He was making another one of his friendly visits. Just wanted to see how you were settling in. Jake, Thorne said, stepping into the living room with an easy smile. Max, from his spot by Jake's chair, immediately rose to his feet, a low growl already building in his chest. Jake forced a neutral expression. Getting there, Captain. It's a slow process. Thorne's eyes swept the room. They lingered for a fraction of a second on the old family photos on the wall before settling on Jake. Good, good. We're all rooting for you. His gaze then fell to Max. The dog was now standing stock still, his body rigid. His lip curled back just enough to reveal the tip of a canine. Thorne's smile tightened. That dog. He really doesn't like me. He's protective, Jake said, his voice level. Then he took a risk. A small one, but a risk nonetheless. He seems to have a good memory for things he saw in the woods. The change in Thorne's demeanor was almost imperceptible, but to a trained cop like Jake, it was a seismic shift. A flicker of something cold and sharp passed through the captain's eyes. The easygoing facade cracked for a nanosecond, revealing the predator beneath. Thorne knew. He didn't know what Jake knew, but he knew the spell of the victim was broken. Memory is a tricky thing. Riley, Thorne said, his voice losing its warmth. Especially after a trauma. The mind can play tricks, invent things. You just focus on what's real, on what's in the official report. That's the truth. He clapped Jake lightly on the shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a threat than a comfort. You get some rest? As Thorne walked out the door, Jake knew he had made a fatal error. He had shown his hand. Thorne was a master strategist. He knew he couldn't risk Jake remembering more. Or worse. Digging into the past, he had to act. Not just to silence Jake, but to obliterate his credibility. The perfect defense was a preemptive strike. That night. Long after the precinct had emptied out. Thorne used his master key to enter the locker room. The silence was broken only by the hum of the ventilation system. He moved with quiet efficiency, pulling a small, sealed evidence bag from his pocket. Inside was a burner phone and a thick stack of marked bills cash that had been logged as destroyed in a drug case months ago. He opened Jake Riley's locker and tucked the package deep inside an old gym bag. He was planting a seed, and he knew exactly how to make it grow. The next morning, the walls came crashing in. 2 uniformed officers and a stern-faced detective from Internal Affairs were at Jake's door before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. They were accompanied by a pale, horrified-looking Dave Miller, who was clearly there as a witness from Jake's own unit. Jake Riley, the IA detective said, his voice devoid of emotion. We have a warrant to search the premises. Sarah stood by, her face white with shock, as they turned their house upside down. It was a violation, a calculated act of humiliation. At the same time, another IA team was at the precinct. Opening Jake's locker in front of a department-wide assembly, Thorne had called under the guise of a procedural update. The call came an hour later. Patched through to the detective's phone. The precinct chief's voice was grim. The burner phone and marked bills had been found. The IA detective turned to Jake. Officer Riley, based on evidence recovered from your locker at the precinct and an anonymous tip regarding your involvement in extortion activities, I am informing you that you are suspended from duty, effective immediately. He held out his hand. Your badge and service weapon. Now, it was a surreal, out-of-body experience. Jake numbly unclipped his badge from his belt and handed it over. The piece of metal that had defined his adult life feeling like a worthless trinket. They didn't arrest him. The investigation had to look legitimate, but they had effectively destroyed him, as the IA team filed out. Dave Miller hung back, his face a mess of confusion and anguish. Jake, I don't understand. It's a setup, Dave, Jake said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Just then, Captain Thorne's SUV pulled up again. He got out, his face a perfect mask of grave disappointment. He walked past Dave and stopped in front of Jake. I'm sorry, Riley, Thorne said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. I never would have believed it, but the evidence. He shook his head slowly. Then he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper that only Jake could hear. I told you to focus on the truth. It was a confession and a death sentence all in one. Thorne gave him one last look, a look of cold, clinical pity that said, This is my world. You are nothing. He turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing in the doorway of his violated home, stripped of his badge, his honor, and his identity. He was no longer a cop. He was a criminal suspect, a pariah. Thorne hadn't just closed the walls in. He had buried him in a new kind of grave. The silence that followed Thorne's departure was heavier and more suffocating than any prison cell. Jake was adrift in a sea of public disgrace. The news, as expected, broke quickly and brutally. Decorated cop suspended in extortion probe. The local news headlines screamed. His photo was everywhere. The hero of St. Florian had become a villain overnight. The phone rang incessantly with calls from reporters, which Sarah unplugged with a quiet fury. They were on an island, the two of them and Max, with the tide of public opinion and the full weight of the justice system rising against them. At the precinct, Dave Miller felt like he was walking through a stranger's world. The familiar camaraderie was gone, replaced by hushed whispers and sideways glances. He had been there. He had seen the IA officers pull the bag from Jake's locker. The evidence was irrefutable. A textbook case of a dirty cop. His logical mind, the part of him that had been honed by years of police work, told him to accept the facts. But his gut was screaming that the facts were a lie. He sat in his patrol car, parked in a secluded spot overlooking the city, and let the events replay in his mind. The frame-up was too clean, too cinematic, the anonymous tip arriving at the perfect time. Thorne's performance of the shocked and disappointed commander, it all felt rehearsed. Then his thoughts drifted back to the hospital room. He replayed the moment Thorne had entered, and the instantaneous, visceral transformation of the dog. Max hadn't just been protective, he had been full of hate. It was the reaction of a witness, not a pet. An animal couldn't be fooled by a badge or a title. It reacted to instinct, to the scent of a threat. Why would the dog who walked through fire for Jake react to his commanding officer as if he were the devil himself? And finally, there was Jake, the man he'd partnered with for 5 years, the man he'd seen run into a burning building to save a child, the man who donated half his overtime pay to the local youth center. The Jake Riley he knew and the man described in the IA report were two different. Incompatible people. One of them had to be a fiction. Dave slammed his fist on the steering wheel, a surge of anger cutting through his confusion. He was being asked to believe a bag of evidence over 5 years of brotherhood. He was being asked to betray the character of the best man he had ever known. And he couldn't do it. He wouldn't do it in that moment. He made a choice. It was a choice that could cost him his career, his pension, everything he had worked for. But the alternative to stand by and watch his partner be devoured by wolves was unthinkable. That evening, using a cheap burner phone he bought for cash at a gas station, he made a call. Jake answered on the first ring, his voice wary. "Who is this?" "It's me," Dave said quietly. "Don't talk. Just listen. Meet me in 1 hour. The old North Point diner. Come in the back entrance. Come alone." He hung up before Jake could reply. The North Point diner was a relic. A 24-hour establishment on the far edge of town where tired truckers and night shift workers went for coffee that was strong and conversation that was scarce. Jake arrived, his leg aching, his body tense with suspicion. He slid into a booth at the back, his face hidden by the shadows. A few minutes later, Dave came in through the back, his head on a swivel, checking to make sure he hadn't been followed. He slid into the booth opposite Jake. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. "They're going to try and turn you against me," Jake said, his voice flat. "Offer you a deal to testify. They already have." Dave admitted, "Promised me a commendation for helping to root out corruption." He shook his head, a look of disgust on his face. "I looked at that IA file, Jake. It's perfect. Too perfect. And then I remembered your dog." Jake leaned forward. "What about him?" His eyes. "Man, the way he looked at Thorne," Dave said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Animals know. They just know. I trust that dog's instincts more than I trust any file Thorne had his hands on." He took a deep breath. "I don't know what kind of mess you're in, and I don't know who you've pissed off, but I know you're not a dirty cop. So, whatever this is, you're not in it alone. I'm with you." A crack appeared in Jake's armor of cold fury, and for the first time in days, a flicker of something other than despair shone through. He wasn't entirely alone. He had an ally, a partner, a man on the inside who was willing to risk it all. "Thank you, Dave," Jake said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Don't thank me yet," Miller replied, his expression grim but resolute. "Thorne is powerful and he's smart, but he thinks he's already won. That's where we're going to have our advantage. He won't see us coming." Outside, the rain began to fall again, streaking down the diner's grimy windows. But inside the small booth, in the flickering neon light, a partnership was reforged, and a quiet, desperate rebellion had just begun. Their rebellion began in the dim light of Jake's garage. Amidst the smell of oil and old lumber, the enemy was a ghost with the full power of the department behind him. Their only weapons were a box of 20-year-old secrets and a borrowed micro-cassette player. Night after night, Jake and Dave huddled over the machine, a plate of untouched sandwiches between them. As the fragile tapes spooled out their ghostly whispers, they listened to hours of static, garbled conversations, and hissing silence. It was painstaking, soul-crushing work. They heard Jake's father interviewing informants who spoke in code, their voices thin with fear. They heard him murmuring his own notes, theories connecting Thorne to missing evidence. It was all circumstantial, a web of suspicion with no hard center. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking. The IA investigation against Jake was proceeding with terrifying speed, and Dave reported that Thorne was pushing for a swift resolution, a formal indictment. Jake's despair began to fester, turning into a cold, helpless rage. He hit his lowest point on a Tuesday night. Dave had just left, his face etched with the same exhaustion and frustration that Jake felt. Sarah tried to comfort him, but he pushed her away, the injustice of it all choking him. "What's the point?" "Sarah," he snapped, his voice raw. "It's over. He's won. He took my job, my honor, and now he's going to take my freedom. I dedicated my life to that badge, and the people holding it are burying me." He retreated to the living room, slumping into his armchair in the dark, the weight of his father's failure and his own impending doom crushing the air from his lungs. He was done. The fight was gone. Max, who had been watching the tense exchange from the hallway, padded silently into the room. He saw the slump of his human's shoulders, felt the profound wave of despair radiating from him. He rested his heavy head on Jake's knee and let out a soft, sympathetic whine. Jake absently stroked the dog's head, his movements listless, for a moment. Max stayed there, offering what little comfort he could. Then, as if coming to a decision, he stood up and trotted purposefully towards the back door. Jake watched him go, not thinking much of it. A minute later, Max returned. He was carrying something in his mouth, something he held with a gentle reverence. It was a small, black object, caked in dried mud and bits of leaf litter. He walked directly to Jake's chair and dropped it onto the rug with a soft thud. He then sat back on his haunches, his tail giving a single, expectant thump against the floor. "Not now, boy." Jake sighed, assuming it was a rock or a piece of wood from the yard. "I'm not in the mood for games," but Max was insistent. He nudged the object with his nose, pushing it closer to Jake's foot, and whined again, a sharp, clear sound that pierced Jake's fog of misery. Annoyed, Jake leaned down, his joints aching, and picked it up. It was heavier than he expected, made of a hard, dense plastic. He rubbed the grime away with his thumb, and then his breath caught in his throat. His heart, which had been a dull, heavy stone in his chest, gave a violent lurch. He knew what it was. Every cop did. It was the solid-state memory unit from his patrol car's mobile video recorder system. The MVR's black box, a small, nearly indestructible device designed to be ejected and survive a crash, recording everything from the dash-mounted camera. The forensics team had listed it in their report as unrecoverable, likely lost in the storm-swept mud of the forest. They had given up looking for it after an hour. But Max hadn't given up. The realization struck Jake with the force of a physical blow. This incredible dog, this silent witness, had done more than just find him and lead a rescue party. He must have returned to that hallowed, terrifying ground, the place where his master had been taken, guided by a scent trail or a memory of the truth. He had found this single, most vital piece of the crime scene, knowing its importance, sensing Jake's scent all over it. He had carried it away and hidden it, keeping it safe. He had been waiting, holding on to his final, most precious gift for the moment his partner needed it most. For this moment, the despair vanished, incinerated by a sudden, blinding flash of hope. The box was scarred and dirty. The memory card inside was likely corrupted, damaged. But it wasn't lost. It was here. It was the one thing Thorne couldn't control. The one piece of evidence he didn't know existed. It was the smoking gun. His hands shaking, Jake pulled out his phone and dialed Dave's number. "Dave." "Get back here," he said, his voice tight with an urgency that made his partner sit bolt upright. "Get back here right now." "What is it? Did you find something on the tapes?" Jake looked down at the black box clutched in his hand, then at the magnificent, loyal dog sitting at his feet. "No," Jake said, a wild grin spreading across his face for the first time in weeks. "He found something for me." Dave Miller arrived back at Jake's house in under 15 minutes, his tires screeching in the driveway. He burst through the door to find Jake sitting at the kitchen table, cradling the muddy black box as if it were a holy relic. "Let me see," Dave breathed, his eyes wide. He took the MVR unit, turning it over in his hands. "I can't believe it. The forensics team swore this was gone." "How, Max?" Jake said simply, nodding towards the dog who sat faithfully at his feet. "He was holding onto it for us." The elation of the discovery quickly gave way to a formidable new problem. The memory card was housed inside a tamper-proof, proprietary casing. They couldn't just plug it into a laptop, and taking it to the department's forensic tech unit was impossible. That was Thorne's territory. Handing it over would be like handing a signed confession back to the killer. "I know a guy," Dave said after a moment of intense thought. Leo? Leo Petrov. He was the department's top tech guru for years, a wizard with data recovery. He retired 5 years ago, said he was sick of the politics. Runs a private business out of his garage now. Dave pulled out his burner phone. He's paranoid, hates cops, and trusts no one. But he owes me a favor. Let me see if he's still a man of his word. The call was tense and cryptic. Dave didn't give details, only saying it was a matter of life and death and that he was cashing in his chip. A grumbling voice on the other end gave them an address and a warning. "Come to the back alley, and if I see a single flashing light." The door stays shut forever. 2 hours later. They were in a cluttered workshop that smelled of soldering fumes and burnt coffee. Leo Petrov was a bear of a man with a wild gray beard and eyes that missed nothing. He looked at the two cops in the muddy MVR unit with deep suspicion. "Miller? You look like hell." Leo grunted. He then looked at Jake. "And you're the guy from the news." The hero turned 0. "What do you want from me?" Jake, leaning on a cane, told him everything. He laid out the whole story, from the attack in the woods to his father's hidden files to the frame-up. He told him about Max. Leo listened, his expression unreadable, stroking his beard. When Jake finished, the workshop was silent. Leo stared at the black box on his workbench. "So you're telling me," he said slowly, his voice a low rumble, "that a dog is a better detective than our entire department." "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Jake replied. Leo was silent for another long moment, then let out a heavy sigh that seemed to come from his boots. The department buried a case I worked on once. A good man went to prison for something he didn't do. I know what they're capable of. He picked up the MVR unit. All right, but I'm making no promises. This thing has been through hell. The card inside is likely fried, corrupted, or both. What followed was the longest night of Jake's life. Leo worked with the focus of a surgeon, disassembling the casing, carefully extracting the memory card, and hooking it up to a complex array of hardware. Sarah arrived, bringing a thermos of coffee, her presence a silent, supportive anchor in the tense room. They watched as Leo coaxed the machine, running diagnostic after diagnostic, his face illuminated by the green text scrolling across his monitor. The progress bar for the data reconstruction moved at a glacial pace. Hours bled together, just as the first hint of dawn began to soften the dark sky. Leo threw his hands up in frustration. It's no good. The primary data clusters are gone, wiped out by the impact and water damage. I'm sorry, kid. There's nothing here. A wave of cold. Final defeat washed over Jake. It was over. Their last hope was gone. Sarah put her arm around him, her own eyes glistening with tears. Wait, Leo suddenly said. Leaning so close to the monitor his nose was almost touching it. There's a fragment, a tiny protected fragment in the buffer cache. It must have been locked in on impact. His fingers flew across the keyboard. The video is a lost cause, a corrupted mess, but the audio... I think I have a few seconds of audio. He rerouted the output to his main speakers and clicked his mouse. The speakers hissed with static. The sound of the torrential rain from that night flooding the room. Then, a voice. Garbled but recognizable as Jake's ice patch. I'm stepping out to investigate. The voice was cut off by the sound of a struggle. A sickening thud, then through the static. Another voice sliced through the air. It was calm, clear, and dripping with ice. It was the unmistakable voice of Captain Marcus Thorne. Finish it. No witnesses. The clip ended, plunging the room into a stunned, ringing silence. They stared at the speakers, their hearts hammering in their chests. Leo slowly swiveled in his chair, his eyes wide. It was real. It was undeniable. It was Thorne's own voice, sentencing himself. Jake looked at Dave, then at Sarah. The long, desperate race for the truth was over. They had him. They had it all. Another adventure waiting for you. See you next time. Leo Petrov. The cynical man who had retired out of disgust for the system. Made the call himself. He didn't call a desk sergeant or some detective. He called Police Chief Peterson's private number, waking him at the crack of dawn and saying only 8 words. You need to get to my workshop? Now, when Chief Peterson, a man near retirement with the weary eyes of someone who had seen it all, walked into Leo's workshop, he found a scene that would stick with him forever. Jake Riley, one of his best officers whom he had just signed the suspension papers for, stood gaunt and exhausted, flanked by Dave Miller, who looked like he'd aged 10 years in a week. Between them was a lean dog with wise eyes, and on a speaker, a few seconds of audio played that shattered the silence, destroyed the legacy of a respected officer, and shook the entire police department to its very foundation. The plan was laid quickly and quietly. No formal warrant was issued. No paper trail was created. This was a betrayal that had to be handled from within. A cancer that had to be excised cleanly in front of the very people it had infected. The next morning, the daily briefing was business as usual. Over 50 officers milled about the large assembly room, sipping coffee and trading tired stories. There was a tension in the air. The Jake Riley scandal had cast a pall over them all. Captain Marcus Thorne stood at the front of the room. As he always did, he projected an aura of confidence and authority, a beacon of stability in a tumultuous time. He was discussing patrol schedules, his voice resonant and commanding. We need to increase our presence in the northern sector, he was saying, gesturing to a map. After the Riley incident, Public trust has been shaken. It's our job to show them that this department—" He trailed off. The doors at the back of the assembly room had opened. Police Chief Peterson had walked in. At his side was Dave Miller. And at Dave's side, leaning on a cane with a face like stone, was Jake Riley, trailing them. Walking with a quiet dignity was Max. A hush fell over the room. A shocked whisper spread like wildfire. Jake Riley, the pariah, was here. In the heart of the precinct that had cast him out, Thorne turned, a flash of anger and disbelief in his eyes before he masked it with a look of feigned concern. "Chief, what is this? Riley isn't authorized to be here." Chief Peterson didn't answer him. He simply nodded to the audio technician at the back of the room. "Play it." A hiss of static erupted from the precinct's intercom system, making everyone jump. Then, the sound of torrential rain and howling wind filled the room. A familiar voice. "Jake's?" "Came through. Cut off dispatch. I'm stepping out to investigate." A sound of a struggle, a sickening thud, and then another voice, unclear, cold, unmistakable. "Finish it. No witnesses." The audio clip ended. The silence it left behind was more deafening than any scream. 50 police officers stood like statues, their faces a portrait of disbelief turning to horror. They looked from the silent speaker to the man at the front of the room. The man they had trusted. The man they had followed into the dark. Thorne's face was ashen. His confidence shattered like glass. For a moment, he just stood there, exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. A king stripped bare before his court. Chief Peterson strode forward, his voice low and heavy with sorrow. "Marcus Thorne, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, assault on a police officer, and obstruction of justice." He turned to 2 senior detectives standing nearby, who were staring, pale-faced. "Cuff him," as the detectives moved in. Thorne's expression shifted again. From shock to the cornered rage of an animal. "You can't do this. It's a setup." It was Riley, but no one was listening. The entire room was looking at him, not with anger, but with a deep, crushing sorrow. And that's when the tears started. They weren't just tears of shock. They were tears for the hideous betrayal of their trust. They were tears for their brother, Jake, who had been framed and nearly killed by the man he called his commander. They were tears of relief that the truth, no matter how ugly, was finally out. And as Thorne was cuffed and led through the silent room, every eye fell on Max. The dog had stood quietly by Jake's side the entire time. He watched Thorne being led away, and then he looked up at Jake. He didn't bark or growl. He simply let out a soft, knowing whine and pressed his head into Jake's hand. It was that simple act that had the whole force in tears. Hardened men and women who faced down danger every day were broken by the absolute, unbreakable loyalty of this animal. The dog hadn't just saved a hero, it had saved the soul of their precinct. It had exposed the villain in their midst, and in doing so, had given them back the hero they had lost. Justice, once unleashed, moved swiftly and irrevocably. Faced with the undeniable audio recording and the testimony of those he had betrayed, Marcus Thorne confessed. His network of corruption, the modern-day Operation Nightingale, crumbled like a house of cards. The officers involved were arrested, buried evidence was unearthed, and old cases were reopened. A cleansing was returning to the department, long and painful, but necessary, a few weeks later. A ceremony was held in the briefing room, the same space where the truth had been revealed. The room was packed with officers, but this time the air was not one of tension or fear, but of respect and renewal. Chief Peterson stood at the podium, but he wasn't addressing the crowd. He was speaking directly to Jake, who stood before him in a crisp dress uniform. "Jake Riley," Peterson said, his voice resonating with sincerity. On behalf of this entire department, I apologize. We failed you, but your courage, your persistence, and your unshakable integrity did not fail us. You reminded us all what this badge is supposed to mean. He took Jake's own badge, shiny and polished, and pinned it back on his chest. Welcome back, Detective Riley. The room erupted in a thunderous, sustained applause. Jake, now Detective Riley, felt a warmth spread through his chest. Dave Miller was the first to embrace him, clapping his friend hard on the back. But the ceremony wasn't over, and we have one more member of the force to recognize, Peterson said, with a grin. He knelt and scratched Max behind the ears, who had been sitting patiently at Jake's feet. Max, for your extraordinary loyalty and unparalleled investigative skills, we are proud to name you the official K-9 ambassador for the St. Florian Police Department. An officer stepped forward with a new leather collar. Attached to it was a small, silver badge, engraved with the words K-9 Hero, Max. As the collar was fastened, the dog held his head high and let out a single, joyous, booming bark, which sent the room into another round of laughter and applause that afternoon as the warm, summer sun beat down. The Rileys' backyard was a sanctuary of peace. The smell of freshly cut grass filled the air. Sarah sat on a porch swing, her hand resting on her stomach. Where a new life was quietly beginning, Jake stood in the middle of the lawn, throwing a tennis ball. The limp was gone, and the ghosts that had haunted him were finally beginning to recede. He was no longer a victim, an outcast, or an avenger. He was a husband, a father-to-be, a detective. He threw the ball high into the blue sky. Max, no longer the gaunt specter of the woods, but a healthy, muscular animal with a gleaming coat, took off. He leaped, a picture of pure joy and power, and snagged the ball out of the air with a satisfying clap of his jaw. He sprinted back to Jake, dropped the ball at his feet, and looked up with bright, loyal, amber eyes, panting happily, ready for the next throw. Jake bent down, ruffling the fur on the head of the dog, who had saved him in more ways than one. They had walked through the darkness together, a broken man and a lost dog, and found their way home, watching his wife smile at them, his truest friend at his side. Jake felt a sense of peace so deep and complete it felt like a prayer. Their life was no longer a story of survival. It was a promise of a new beginning,